The idea for Dharma Wave came about after I spent years in traditional Buddhist lineages, particularly Zen, and observed that some of the teachings and the practices created a kind of a rigidity and an attachment to roles. And you could say spiritual materialism, as Chogyam Trungpa has mentioned. It's a human thing, I think, because I've experienced it also in all the churches and all the spiritual groups I've been in. There's a sense of somehow I'm superior, like I'm better than you because of this spiritual practice. And I noticed that in myself, even after many years of practice, and I didn't like it. And also I noticed a pattern of a kind of a dogma or propaganda of each of these different systems that I think led to a rigidity of mind. And that's not to say that those more rigid systems, someone else is joining us right here, can't be helpful, but surely there's something beyond that that can trust and invite and support each person individually to find the way that works for them. I know there is, because that's what I've had to do in my own spiritual path. And so instead of having a more rigid structure in which you have to do it the way everyone is doing it, which can be very helpful, what's a structure for contemporary society that allows you to evolve the practice that keeps you in the awakened state of the Buddha's realization of awakening, rather than you trying to accommodate or fit into the group norms of some kind of practice, and having to believe or use the monkey mind of parroting back the teachings or trying to force those or digest those when they don't work for you. So I like the name Dharma Wave because a wave has power, and it's also a property, an invisible property of something. It sort of moves through things. It applies to both water and light. And I think through meditation, developing the energetic field of presence, of meditation and awakening is something that happens collaboratively. And in that sense, it's like a wave. It moves invisibly through space and time, invisibly within and without through people. It's a form of consciousness that has an impact, and yet it's invisible. So I like the term wave, and Dharma is a traditional way of bringing in a connection to the teachings of Zen, or the Buddha, who is the archetypal representation with teachings and descriptions of the place of awakening, which I think of as that place in which the normal sense of addicted clinging to what I think of as myself, or you could say the unhealthy habit of daily reinforcing of worship of this ego identity, which is just one of billions on the planet, drops away. And from that place, there's a much more heart-centered and open interconnectedness with all living things, and a care for and an awareness of the way in which awakening is co-arising. That means it's not something one individual person really has or owns. It's not this individual thing that somebody gets, although it can be, perhaps it's experienced as the liberation of a self, and yet the nature of awakening is that you can't find yourself anymore. There isn't a self that can be awakened. So it's almost a different place of consciousness in which consciousness is freed from this tortured clinging to the sense of personal self. And so how do you integrate that with the sense of personal self? Because we function as personal self human beings with feelings and emotions and reactions, and that's the access point. So that's part of the practice. It's part of practicing together. So I think the heart of what I think of as Dharma Wave is creating maps of consciousness that support people practicing in Dharma Wave to find their own paths of what, through a disciplined practice, leads to the possibility of an opening of consciousness and experiencing that awakening referenced by the Buddha, which is part of the birthright of every living human being and within us, and is a spiritual principle which transcends thoughts or language or color or race or belief, right? So there's something in which all the religions have in common, this universal divine realization of the oneness of all, and yet there's many distortions of that realization in terms of thinking and then clinging to that thinking. And I think of all of that as patterns of identification. So the creation of a sense of self and then a defending of that self. So Dharma Wave's intended to offer a broader possibility in which, if you're participating, you're the one who's responsible for your own journey, and I and others involved hopefully can make thought-provoking or helpful suggestions or contributions. And then if we are sitting or meditating together or on retreat together, there are going to be more imposed structures which tend to work better in terms of holding energy for a community. And so, yeah, there will be some requirements of doing what everyone else is doing in order to hold that structure. But I'd like to think of those as having as much possibility to evolve as possible. So a creative realization of not just the field of awakening, but the body of knowledge of attachment and relational theory and psychology of what it takes for human beings to effectively live together with each other. And that's by its nature going to include things like upgrading communication skills, upgrading self-awareness skills, so that, as Dogen, a Soto Zen teacher, supposedly said, something like the way to awakening is to study the self. And when you complete studying the self, you forget the self, and body and mind drop away. So it's not that we don't include the ego and the self and everything to do with it. We study that. And we also study the path that is larger and more holistic than that, within which that occurs, which is the awakened field. And it's in that studying, and by studying, I'm going to suggest the studying the deeper esoteric or spiritual meaning of studying is to be present with a completely open, alive awareness, which is studying what's happening in this moment on every level, and particularly is studying the patterns of internal energy and tightening or loosening, even of the physical body, around these clinging to certain things as myself. And in that studying, and in a kind of a resonant alignment, that's an inward practice that's supported by meditation. And honestly, I don't know any other way to do this in an ongoing way other than by a deep, long-term practice of meditation, in which you learn how to see and align that awareness in a way that liberates those patterns of clinging to self. It's in that liberation that life itself can pass through us and find its correct place. So the other way I think of that is that would be for a person who believes in a deity, that would be living God's will, whichever God it is that you're following. That would be the embodied realization of making yourself a channel of that. Right? So in some sense, I do think of these practices of meditation, of calming the mind, and then using that calmness and equanimity to implement deeper noticings of awareness, and then also integrating that with everything else that includes the emotions and healthy sense of identity, and taking care of that in the body and mind is what leads to a more liberated place. And from that more liberated place of not being caught up in that tiny sense of self, we can afford to be more generous of heart, more compassionate, see the needs of all living beings, which is something that our planet desperately needs right now, is a healing of this huge divide between those of us who are enormously financially and socially privileged, like myself, and many other people who do not have that privilege. And try and find a path through that holds all of that pain and suffering, and attempts to find a way to bring it home in a more healing and complete acknowledgement. So I feel like my words are running out. Hopefully that was helpful as a preliminary understanding about what I'm hoping to accomplish with Dharma Wave. Welcome.